Imagine an army standing on an open African plain, thousands of warriors carrying spears and shields, waiting for an enemy armed with rifles, artillery, and military discipline. On one side stood the British Empire, one of the most powerful forces of the 19th century. On the other stood the Zulu Kingdom, a rising African power whose warriors had been transformed into one of the most feared fighting forces in southern Africa. What happened next shocked the world. In a single battle, a Zulu army surrounded and destroyed a much larger British force, leaving behind one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. But the story did not end with the Zulu victory. Britain would return with a much larger army, and the war would eventually bring destruction to the Zulu Kingdom itself. This is the story of the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, the rise of King Cetshwayo, the legendary Battle of Isandlwana, the desperate defense of Rorke's Drift, and the brutal campaign that ultimately broke one of Africa's most powerful kingdoms. To understand how this happened, we have to travel back to 19th century southern Africa, where the Zulu Kingdom had become a major regional power. The Zulu state had been transformed decades earlier under King Shaka, whose military reforms created a highly organized warrior system. Shaka introduced new methods of close combat, emphasized discipline, developed powerful battlefield formations, and reorganized warriors into age-based regiments known as Amabutho. The Zulu military system allowed the kingdom to mobilize large numbers of warriors quickly, and over time the Zulu became a dominant force in the region. But by the 1870s, the political landscape had changed dramatically. European colonial expansion was spreading across southern Africa. British territories, Boer republics, African kingdoms, and trading interests were increasingly colliding. The British government wanted greater control over the region, and the independent Zulu Kingdom stood directly in the way of a larger political project. King Cetshwayo ruled the Zulu Kingdom during this dangerous period. He was not simply a warrior king. He was attempting to preserve Zulu independence while surrounded by expanding European influence. The Zulu army was powerful, but the British possessed weapons that could change the balance of warfare. British soldiers carried modern rifles, artillery, and disciplined military formations. Yet Britain initially underestimated what the Zulu army could accomplish. The conflict began after a series of political disputes and escalating tensions between the British colonial authorities and the Zulu Kingdom. British officials presented demands that Cetshwayo could not realistically accept without surrendering much of his kingdom's independence. When the ultimatum expired in January 1879, British forces crossed into Zulu territory. The British believed their superior technology and organization would quickly defeat the Zulus. But they faced an enemy who understood the land, could move rapidly, and could gather enormous numbers of warriors. The British invasion was divided into several columns, and one of the most important forces advanced toward the Zulu heartland. Near the mountain of Isandlwana, British troops established a camp. They believed their position was defensible. But they had made a series of critical mistakes. Their camp was not properly fortified. Wagons were not arranged into a defensive circle as they might have been in other colonial campaigns. British commanders also underestimated the speed and coordination of the Zulu army. Meanwhile, thousands of Zulu warriors were moving toward the British position. They did not simply rush forward blindly. Zulu commanders used traditional tactics that emphasized encirclement. The famous horns of the buffalo formation placed the central force against the enemy while two wings moved around the sides, attempting to surround them. Behind these forces could be a reserve, ready to reinforce the attack. At Isandlwana, the British were about to discover how dangerous this strategy could become when combined with overwhelming numbers. On the morning of January 22, 1879, British scouts detected signs of Zulu activity. What followed was one of the most extraordinary battles of the 19th century. The British soldiers opened fire with rifles, and initially their weapons were devastating. The Zulu warriors advanced under heavy fire, and many were killed. But the British ammunition supply and defensive position began to fail under the pressure of the attack. Zulu forces continued moving forward. Their numbers allowed them to absorb terrible losses while maintaining pressure. As the battle developed, the British line became increasingly vulnerable. The Zulu horns moved around the flanks, while other warriors pressed toward the center. Eventually, the British position began to collapse. Soldiers who had expected to fight a conventional colonial battle suddenly found themselves surrounded. There was nowhere safe to retreat. The Zulu attack became a complete assault on the camp. British soldiers attempted to defend themselves, but once their formation broke, individual units were overwhelmed. The battle turned into a desperate struggle for survival. When it was over, the British had suffered a catastrophic defeat. More than 1,000 British and colonial troops were killed, along with African auxiliaries. The Zulu victory at Isandlwana shocked Britain. It was one thing for an African army to resist colonial expansion. It was another thing entirely for that army to destroy a British force in the field. Newspapers and officials in Britain were stunned. The myth of unstoppable British military superiority had been badly damaged. But while the main British force was being destroyed at Isandlwana, another small British position nearby was about to face an attack of its own. At Rorke's Drift, a tiny British garrison occupied a former mission station. The soldiers had no idea that the Zulu victory at Isandlwana had already created a massive crisis. Thousands of Zulu warriors moved toward Rorke's Drift. The British defenders quickly prepared a makeshift defensive position using sacks, boxes, walls, and whatever materials they could find. They were heavily outnumbered. When the Zulu attack began, waves of warriors approached the position. British soldiers fired from behind their defenses, using rifles to keep the attackers at a distance. The fighting became extremely intense. Zulu warriors attempted to break through the defensive line, while British soldiers desperately held their positions. The battle continued for hours. Ammunition was running low. Fires threatened parts of the position. Exhausted soldiers moved between defensive points. The Zulus repeatedly attacked, but the British defenders continued resisting. Eventually, the Zulu forces withdrew. The defense of Rorke's Drift became famous in Britain and was portrayed as an extraordinary act of military courage. But the wider war was far from over. Britain could not accept the humiliation of Isandlwana. Reinforcements were sent to southern Africa. Thousands more soldiers arrived. The British changed their strategy. Instead of advancing with vulnerable columns, they began moving more cautiously, concentrating their forces and using artillery, fortified positions, and supply lines. The Zulu Kingdom faced a terrible problem. It had won one of the most impressive victories of the war, but it could not match Britain's ability to replace soldiers and equipment. The Zulu army relied heavily on close combat weapons. British forces increasingly used rifles and artillery from protected positions. Every battle became more dangerous for the Zulus. King Cetshwayo attempted to navigate a political situation that was rapidly becoming impossible. He needed to defend his kingdom without provoking complete destruction, but British commanders were determined to defeat the Zulu military power. The war continued through the first half of 1879. Zulu forces launched attacks and attempted to resist the British advance, but the balance was shifting. At the Battle of Kambula in March, British forces successfully defended their fortified position against a major Zulu attack, inflicting heavy losses. The lesson was becoming clear. When the British were properly prepared and protected, the Zulu tactics that had devastated them at Isandlwana became much less effective. The British continued advancing toward the Zulu capital. Cetshwayo's kingdom was now under enormous pressure. The final major confrontation came at Ululand in July 1879. The British army formed a massive defensive square, with infantry, artillery, cavalry, and supporting forces arranged in a carefully planned formation. The Zulu army approached. Warriors who had once destroyed a British column at Isandlwana now faced an enemy that had learned from its mistakes. The Zulu attack began, but British rifles and artillery tore into the advancing formations. The Zulu warriors displayed extraordinary courage, moving forward despite devastating fire. But courage could not overcome modern firepower forever. British cavalry pursued retreating Zulu forces, and the battlefield became a scene of destruction. Ululand marked the effective destruction of the Zulu military system. The British burned the royal capital. The kingdom that had once mobilized tens of thousands of warriors was shattered. King Cetshwayo was eventually captured and taken into British custody. The independence of the Zulu Kingdom was effectively broken. But the story of the Zulu War is not simply a story of British technology defeating African warriors. It is a story of political ambition, strategic mistakes, military adaptation, courage, and the consequences of colonial expansion. The British victory came at a cost, and the Zulu resistance demonstrated that European military superiority was not absolute. Isanwena became a symbol of African military resistance precisely because it proved that a well-organized indigenous army could defeat a technologically superior colonial force under the right circumstances. The Zulu warriors had no artillery capable of matching the British guns. They did not have modern rifles in comparable numbers. Yet they understood their strengths. They knew how to move quickly, how to exploit terrain, how to surround an enemy, and how to use overwhelming numbers at the decisive moment. At Isanwena, British commanders made mistakes that allowed those strengths to become devastating. But there is another side of the story that is often forgotten. The war caused enormous suffering among the Zulu population. Villages were destroyed, cattle were seized, and the political structure of the kingdom was deliberately dismantled. After Cetshwayo's capture, the British attempted to divide the kingdom into separate territories ruled by different leaders. Instead of restoring stability, this contributed to further conflict. Rival factions fought each other, and the former unity of the Zulu Kingdom was weakened. Cetshwayo eventually returned from exile, but the political world he returned to had changed. The kingdom he had ruled no longer existed in its previous form. And this is where the story becomes darker. The Battle of Isanwena is often remembered as a glorious Zulu victory. Rorke's Drift is remembered as a heroic British defense. Ulundi is remembered as the final British victory. But behind these famous battles were thousands of individual lives. Zulu warriors were not simply numbers on a battlefield. They were fathers, sons, brothers, farmers, and members of communities. British soldiers were also individuals with families waiting for them thousands of miles away. The war turned political disputes into human tragedy. And the most powerful lesson may be how quickly political pressure can become military disaster. Britain entered the conflict believing that its demands would force the Zulu Kingdom to submit. Instead, it created a war that required thousands of soldiers and cost enormous resources. The Zulus entered the war believing their military strength could defend their independence. Instead, they faced an industrial empire capable of returning with greater force after every defeat. Isanwena proved the Zulus could win. Ulundi proved that one victory could not stop an empire with the resources to continue fighting. This is why the Anglo-Zulu War remains one of the most fascinating conflicts in 19th century history. It contains almost every element of a dramatic historical story, a powerful kingdom surrounded by colonial expansion, a determined king, a disciplined warrior army, political ultimatums, battlefield mistakes, shocking victories, desperate defenses, overwhelming technology, and a final struggle for survival. But perhaps the most haunting image is the moment before Isanwena, when thousands of Zulu warriors moved silently across the landscape toward a British camp whose commanders did not yet understand the danger. The British soldiers believed they were part of an expedition designed to conquer a kingdom. Within hours, many of them would be dead. The Zulus believed they were defending their homeland. Months later, their capital would be burning. History rarely gives one side complete victory. Even when armies win, people lose. Even when kingdoms survive, they change. Even when empires conquer territory, resistance can become part of the memory of the conquered people. The Zulu Kingdom was eventually incorporated into the colonial political order of southern Africa, but the story of its resistance never disappeared. The image of the Zulu warrior with shield and spear became one of the most recognizable symbols of African military history. King Cetshwayo remained an important figure in Zulu historical memory. And Isanwena became a battlefield remembered not simply because Britain lost, but because the battle demonstrated the military power of a society that colonial narratives had often underestimated. Today, when historians study the Anglo-Zulu War, They examined not only the battles but the political decisions that created them. Why did Britain issue demands that threatened Zulu independence? Why did British commanders underestimate the Zulu army? How did Zulu commanders achieve such a devastating victory at Isandlwana? Why did the British recover so quickly? And how did the war reshape the future of southern Africa? The answers reveal a world where military power was changing rapidly. Traditional battlefield courage was still important, but industrial weapons were transforming warfare. Rifles, artillery, logistics, railways, supply systems, and communications increasingly determined which armies could sustain long campaigns. The Zulus demonstrated that traditional weapons could still defeat modern forces when strategy, terrain, surprise, and numbers aligned. But the later battles demonstrated the limits of that advantage. Once Britain adapted its tactics, the technological and logistical imbalance became overwhelming. The tragedy is that the Zulu Kingdom had little opportunity to negotiate from a position of equality. The colonial expansion surrounding it continued regardless of its wishes. The war was therefore not simply a clash between two armies. It was part of a much larger struggle over land, political authority, and the future of southern Africa. And that is why the story deserves to be remembered beyond the famous battle scenes. The real story is not just about how Zulu warriors defeated the British at Isandlwana. It is about how an independent kingdom fought to remain independent while facing an empire whose political and military power was expanding across the continent. The Zulus won a battle that seemed impossible. They shocked the British Empire. They demonstrated extraordinary courage. But eventually, the empire returned with greater numbers, greater firepower, and a strategy designed to prevent another Isandlwana. At Ulundi, the balance of power became undeniable. The Zulu military system was broken, the capital was burned, and Cetshwayo's kingdom was brought under British control. Yet there is an irony in the final chapter. Britain could defeat the Zulu army, capture the king, and destroy the capital, but it could not erase the memory of the resistance. More than a century later, people still travel to Isandlwana to remember what happened there. The hills and plains still hold the memory of the battle. The landscape that witnessed one of Britain's greatest military disasters also witnessed the determination of a kingdom fighting for its independence. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Anglo-Zulu War. Military power can destroy armies, but it cannot easily destroy identity. The Zulu Kingdom lost the war, but the courage of its warriors became part of history. Isandlwana remains a reminder that no empire is invincible on every battlefield, and Ulundi remains a reminder that one spectacular victory is not always enough to defeat a much larger power. Between those two battles lies the real story, a story of ambition, resistance, strategy, courage, suffering, and the brutal transformation of southern Africa. The war ended in 1879, but its consequences continued for generations. And when we look back at the Zulu warriors standing beneath the African sky with shields in their hands, we should remember that they were not simply soldiers from a distant past. They were people defending a world they knew was changing. They understood that something larger than a single battle was at stake. They were fighting for the survival of a kingdom, and although they could not stop the expansion of the British Empire, their resistance ensured that the story of the Zulu Kingdom would never be forgotten. At Isandlwana, the British learned that the Zulus could defeat an empire. At Ulundi, the Zulus learned how far an empire was willing to go to win. And between those two battles was one of the most dramatic wars in African history.